Unknown to people, giants have been taking their kids at night to consume them. But after one young girl sees a giant in the night, everything shifts. It is midnight in the city of London, and a young girl named Sophie is checking that all the doors and windows of her orphanage are securely shut, because this is the time known as the witching hour, when people disappear. As Sophie follows all the safety measures, the presence of something or someone enormous hovers over the town. As the other kids at the orphanage rest, Sophie remains awake in her bed reading. The shelter cat notices something and steps out onto the balcony. Sophie trails the cat outside and spots a huge man in the street. The enormous figure realizes that Sophie has spotted him. Frightened beyond belief, Sophie curls up in her blanket, but the giant reaches into the orphanage and takes Sophie along with her blanket. Holding Sophie, the giant begins to leave the town. He evades being seen by others using a number of smart tactics. Once he leaves the town, the giant bounds across the countryside toward the cliffs, making huge jumps with his long legs. At last, he makes a big jump and leaps into the clouds. They reach an unfamiliar place, where the giant takes Sophie into his home. The giant lifts Sophie in her blanket and starts cutting up some vegetables for a stew. Sophie attempts to flee when the giant isn't watching, but she creates a noise and the giant hears her. The giant talks to Sophie and informs her that she can't get away unless she has wings. Sophie inquires about their location and he responds that they are in giant country. More giants are heard outside, and Sophie pleads with this one not to consume her. The huge figure chuckles at her and assures her that he is not a terrifying cannibal. He would never consume her. Sophie argues that he is a beast because he took her away. The giant responds that he feels quite sorry for doing that, particularly for her mom and dad. Sophie mentions that she's an orphan, so she lacks any parents. She inquires of the giant whether the other giants are kind like him, and he answers that they are not. They would devour her without a moment's hesitation. He also mentions that in comparison to him, the other giants are huge. He is a small one in giant land. Sophie inquires why he brought her here, and he responds that he needed to. If he didn't, she would inform everyone that she spotted a giant and he would be caught by the humans and placed in a zoo. Sophie assures him that she won't share anything with anyone and requests him to take her back home, but he does not trust her. He states she will now spend the remainder of her life here with him. Sophie states that if he doesn't allow her to leave, she will escape, and he cautions her that if she ever departs this house without him, the other giants will devour her. The giant pulls out a jar with a blue glow shifting within it, and Sophie asks about it. The giant claims it's a dream, while Sophie argues that dreams aren't real things. The giant reads Sophie's story, and Sophie drifts off to sleep. While she rests, the giant ventures into a more secluded area of his home, where many jars contain lights dancing within them. He takes a jar with a red glow and starts working on it. Sophie gets up and sees that the giant is dozing. She seizes the chance to flee through a window, but as she is dashing away, a much larger giant appears in front of her and catches her. Sophie yells for assistance, but the kind giant simply shuts the door to his cave home because he is powerless. The huge giant lifts Sophie and swallows her. Sophie awakens and understands this was merely a dream that the kind giant intentionally provided to show her that dreams are real experiences. The following morning, the giant is sipping a fizzy beverage known as Frob's Coddle, and Sophie observes that the bubbles in the drink rise downward instead of upward, as they do in regular drinks. She mentions this, and the giant replies that floating bubbles above lead to unpleasant burps. Sophie contends that downward floating bubbles likely emerge in a much poorer manner, but the giant appears indifferent to that. He releases a huge gas that propels him off the ground like a rocket. He really enjoys it. At that moment, one of the enormous man-eating giants shows up, and the kind giant conceals Sophie to keep her safe. In the difficult situation, Sophie hides inside a vegetable and barely escapes being eaten after the kind giant persuades the other giant that he dislikes vegetables and only consumes human beings. Later, the kind giant brings Sophie into the heart of his cave home and assists her in tidying up. He hands her a selection of clothes to choose a new outfit. Sophie wears a red jacket, she discovers, and the giant gives her an odd, nearly sorrowful glance when he notices her. Sophie inquires about his problem, but he remains silent. He puts Sophie in a cozy room within a tree and mentions that he is stepping out to do his work, which is capturing dreams. Sophie states she wishes to accompany him, but he firmly declines. Sophie gazes at a few of the dreams in the jars and watches them take shape. She persistently insists on accompanying the kind giant, and he ultimately consents. They walk out of the cave house and see all the fierce giants resting. They attempt to slip by them, but they awaken and seize the friendly giant by the leg. Sophie hurries and conceals herself in a damaged old car while all the cruel giants torment the kind giant. They treat him like a football and toss him around. Sophie can't understand why he isn't standing up for himself. Out of nowhere, it begins to rain, and all the fierce giants flee and seek shelter because they dislike water. The kind giant places Sophie in his bag and hurries off. Without his knowledge, he unintentionally leaves Sophie's blanket behind, and the other giants catch its scent and understand that he has a human with him. Sophie and the giant reach a location that the giant refers to as the Dream Country. Sophie notices that the stars above are glowing brightly. The giant claims that on a sufficiently clear night, his enormous ears can catch melodies from the stars. He mentions that he also listens to insects conversing in the soil, ladybugs moving on the foliage, plants and leaves communicating with one another, and all the hidden murmurs of the world. Sophie observes the reflection of the enormous tree in the water and realizes that it is filled with dreams. The giant mentions that at one time someone referred to him as the big friendly giant. He leaps into the water and steps into another dimension. He requests Sophie to accompany him, and she complies. They both stand before the tree where all dreams start. The large kind giant sees a golden dream and remarks that it's a quite uncommon kind. He attempts to grab it, but it constantly eludes him. The dream eases near Sophie, and he mentions the dream acknowledges her. He mentions that when he hears it, he can catch her voice. He places the dream in a jar, marking it as Sophie's dream. Sophie assists the giant in capturing dreams until she encounters a red one that is a bad dream. The giant takes hold of the crimson dream and clarifies that the crimson dream represents a sense of regret. It reveals to individuals the terrible actions they've taken and informs them that there is no absolution. The giant takes Sophie out of the other dimension and they set off on their journey. While walking, Sophie mentions that from now on she will refer to the big friendly giant as BFG. Sophie and BFG reach London, where BFG uses his enormous trumpet to send joyful dreams to people as they slumber. He tells the joyful stories for Sophie and she adores them. While they are strolling back home, they notice all the other giants heading out to search for human kids to consume. Sophie mentions they need to find a solution to stop this. In this discussion, they also figure out that Sophie left her blanket behind in Giant Country, and suddenly BFG's expression turns serious. Then Sophie awakens in front of the orphanage. BFG explains that since they left her blanket in Giant Country, the other giants are now aware of her presence, making her no longer secure with him. Sophie believes that they can halt the other giants together, but BFG shares a tale of how he once brought another boy to Giant Country. The boy noticed BFG just as Sophie did, so BFG had to bring him along. The red coat that Sophie discovered was owned by that boy. After a while, the other giants discovered the boy, and BFG did not return him home quickly enough to protect him from their anger. BFG decides that he won't make that error again with Sophie, and he departs despite Sophie's objections. Sophie is on the balcony of the orphanage and talks to BFG, aware that his giant ears can still hear her. She claims she can feel him close by, and to make him show himself, she leaps off the balcony. BFG grabs her. The two go back to Giant Country and start coming up with a strategy to stop the other giants. At that moment, the other cruel giants show up and begin searching for Sophie throughout the house. They ruin BFG's efforts in the process. Sophie narrowly escapes being seen by the giants, and at last BFG concludes he's reached his limit. He drives the cruel giants away from his home with a burning stick. At the same time, Sophie is concealed in the chamber that BFG created for the previous boy he took to Giant Country. She sees a photo of the queen and devises a strategy. They craft a unique vision for the queen that depicts giants consuming children and the army intervening. The vision also features Sophie and BFG. When she awakens from that dream, Sophie and the BFG will greet her, and she will be eager to hear them out. They reach the palace and send the dream toward the queen as she slumbers. The queen awakens and shares the dream with her assistant, who remarks that it is interesting since children have indeed been vanishing mysteriously throughout the country. As the queen's aide moves to shut the curtains, she spots Sophie standing there, and the queen remembers her from the dream. Sophie shares everything with the queen, and the queen trusts her because she just witnessed it all in her dream. Sophie then presents BFG to the queen, who clumsily meets her. Next, the queen tells the generals about the danger of the giants while preparing a lunch for BFG. Because of his large mannerisms, the lunch is an uncomfortable and funny event. BFG even has the queen and all her attendants and commanders sample frobscottle, which gives them amazing gas. Next, BFG guides the royal army to the land of giants. He forms a vision of sorrow to provide the other cruel giants so that they would awaken filled with guilt and be simple targets for the army. Sophie and the BFG sit and talk about Sophie's shining dream. Sophie inquires about the dream, and the BFG responds that it represents Sophie's wish for a typical life. He claims she will possess it, but not in this large nation. She has to return to her world. Sophie inquires if BFG will still listen to her whenever she shouts for him, and in response, he simply gestures to his enormous ears. The moment arrives to send the dream toward the giants, and BFG remembers he left his trumpet in London. When he isn't watching, Sophie snatches the dream jar and takes it straight to the center of the sleeping giants. She is just about to open it when one giant stirs awake. Sophie succeeds in shattering the jar and filling the leftover giants with sorrowful dreams, but the first one stays clear and ordinary. He is ready to strike Sophie when BFG intervenes and protects her. The giant gets ready to strike BFG when the royal army shows up and halts him. The royal army captures and holds all the cruel giants and goes on to take them away, finally liberating giant country from their menace. The cruel giants are taken to a distant island from which there is no way out. The sole thing they receive to consume for the remainder of their lives is vegetables. They are not pleased about it. Next, Sophie awakens at the queen's palace and is welcomed by her aide. In the meantime, BFG has a vast land all to himself. He is cultivating a garden filled with tasty vegetables and focusing on writing a book about all his experiences. Returning to the palace, Sophie greets the BFG with a good morning to the air, fully aware that he can hear her no matter where he is. And indeed, he does.